One thing I was interested in, personally, is just kind of in terms of your own background. The have you had a grandmother, I gather, who was born during the Battle of Atlanta.
That is what I had always been told. I think that may have been a family whopper too, because Scott, our third son, was doing a paper for Georgia State in
Uh-huh.
which he traced his family in Atlanta from one neighborhood to another and found that the grandmother I had thought was born in 1864 in Atlanta was actually born in 1861. So she was in Atlanta, but she was not born while the Yankees were occupying the rest of the house. She was about 4 years old,
And
but
you
she was here.
and this is a grandmother on the
My
Kaiser
mother's,
side.
yeah, the Kaiser side. Her name was Elkin,
Okay.
and looking over at the stuff at the Historical Society, I find that her father was Edward Elkin, and he was a printer.
Okay. And then on your father's side, obviously, it's half Jewish.
Yes, my father's mother.
The Schwabs themselves were not.
No, I think not, although that is a little difficult for me to determine. They certainly were not religiously Jewish, and I don't think they were. Her name was Newalt, which had been anglicized from Neuwelt, and it was they were from Vienna. And the only way that nobody was ever religious, but during the late 1930s, we had a letter from a man named Hans Neuwelt from, I don't know if he'd gotten out of Vienna by then or not, but he wanted to come to this country and he needed somebody to sponsor him, and so we did. And that was Cousin Hans, whom we elated with glad cries.
Are you saying that you were not raised in any religious setting
My
yourself?
mother was Catholic. My father was an agnostic. We had, it was a very interesting situation because my father said that if he died and they had any minister of any persuasion at his funeral, he would rise up out of his coffin and haunt them. And he left specific instructions about which poetry of Robert Ingersoll he wanted read. And he, to our amazement, did die quite young as a result of a fall from a horse. And we wondered what Mother would do. And she did just what he said. The funeral was done as he wanted. And then the next day, she had a solemn requiem high mass said for him. So
Okay.
I sat there thinking what a dirty trick it would be if she prayed him into heaven when he had been so sure there was no such place.
So was he? He was a follower of Ingersoll. Was something of a mentor for him or an
I
inspiration?
think so.
In terms of politics as well, or
I think so. You know, it's funny. In those days, people didn't talk that much about politics, and I was 25 when Dad died.
yeah.
And I feel that I have come to know him better through his books, some of them, than I ever did him. He had the complete works of Shaw. He had Oscar Wilde. He had Mark Twain, and he had blessedly underlined things.
Oh, okay.
And in reading them, I have come to find out that this is where I came from, for
Uh-huh.
better or for worse.
And he was the president of.
Southern Springbed Company,
Southern.
which became Southern Cross Industries.
Which had been a family business.
Yes, it had been begun actually by his uncle, who had taken into business with him his two brothers-in-law, his wife's brother, who had the money, and his sister's husband, who was my grandfather. He was a very gentle, sweet, probably not overly bright man named Otto. So Otto had been president before my father.
Okay.
And when Daddy was about 29, I guess, the story goes that he went in and said to his father, "I'm ready to take over now. You be chairman of the board." So Bappa, as we called him, was chairman of the board for a long, long time. Died at about 88.
And had your father received schooling beyond high school? Or
Yes, he had gone to Georgia Tech, and he was Tech's most enthusiastic alumnus. He was not a large man, but he played on the scrub football team. And from the time I was 5 or 6 on, I was hauled to the Tech football game. And he caused a little trouble at our house during the Depression because Daddy bought a football player for Tech when he insisted that he didn't have enough money to send his own son to college. But he found money to do them both. Anyway, Dad loved it. And it was the pride, I think, of his life that there's an honorary fraternity at Tech called ANAC. I don't know what the ANAK stands for, but it's a combination of intellectual and whatever. And it was not in existence back in 1909 when Daddy graduated. But when they found, at some point they went back and named one person from each class to be in ANAC, and Papa was the class of 1909, and it was a great source of pride. I'm not sure what it represented. A lot of generosity to Tech, who knows?
And what about your mother and her background?
A little bit harder to tell. Mother was awfully quiet about her background. In spite of all she tried to say about Alsace-Lorraine, there is that about the personality that made me certain they were Prussians, all of them. Very strong-minded lady.
Everybody likes to claim Alsace-Lorraine.
Yeah, that's nice and comfortable. They married quite young, and she adored my father, and they were married for 33 years before he died. When Britt and I were engaged, he lived right around the corner, and Mother and Dad had his parents over for dinner, and our fathers had met. I think they had business dealing, but our mothers had not. And in the middle of dinner, Britt's mother, who was a gentle, wonderful lady, said, Miss Schwab, you wouldn't remember me, but do you remember Miss So-and-so? And she gave the name, and Mother said, oh yes, she was a seamstress. And Miss Pendergrast said, that's right. Well, I was teaching school, and I had saved all my money to have one dress made by Miss whoever, and I was waiting to have my dress fitted when a beautiful girl swept in with a chauffeur with boxes behind, and someone said to me, that's Helen Kaiser. She is not only the most beautiful girl in Atlanta, she's the richest. Well, it put quite a blight on the dinner party. There was not much to say. Evidently, Mother lived pretty high. And it stayed with her. There are not very many people who can encapsulate their entire philosophy of life in 2 brief sentences, but when Mother was in her early 80s, we were in an elevator at the doctor's building, and Mother, between the 1st and 2nd floor, turned to the people in the elevator and said, this elevator is too crowded. Some of you ought to get off.
It's a cross to bear.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
But what other kinds of, I mean, you've hinted at some, I'm kind of curious, what sorts of influences, childhood influences, do you feel were long-term influences on you?
Well, it was only looking back. I think my father was, very much. I don't think that so far as race was concerned, he had ever thought ahead to the point of integration or any sort of equality, but he had a very human relationship with our servants, and particularly a chauffeur we had who had come to us when he was 16, had very little formal schooling, but had tremendous mechanical ability. Johnny could fix anything, and Daddy was always talking about how brilliant Johnny was, and he evidently was very kind and understanding. And when my father died, Johnny, who had been with the family for 24 years, left and went to go to New York to work for a friend of the family's. I was shocked that he would leave. And he said, "You know, I've been here all these years. Your mother doesn't even know when my birthday is." So that mother would never have asked him to do anything without saying please. She would never have been unfair, but she simply did not really see them as people, I don't think.
But you're saying your father had a somewhat different...
Yes, that
And in other ways too. I mean, it sounds like he may have been more outgoing, or...
yes. I hate to be so unfair to Mother. Mother was extremely hard of hearing, and that was difficult. And so Dad was the sociable one in the family. Daddy liked everybody, and he loved making friends, and he didn't much care who they were. If they looked interesting, that was just fine.
And I gather he was a fairly staunch Republican as well.
Oh, yes. I can remember long before the Hatch Act, when I was in the 4th grade, a teacher saying to me, "You all find out who your parents are going to vote for." And there were 40 children in the class, and there were 38 Democrats, and there was my father and Josephine Large's father, and Joe's father was the Republican postmaster here.
Right.
And I remember coming home to get my father, what is the difference here? And it appeared to be tied up a lot with tariffs.
Right, sure. An issue we don't hear about too much anymore.
No. Later on, when I started being political, I was a Republican, but for totally different reasons.
Right.
But Dad was very understanding, very accepting. So that
You were born around 1921 or there?
1920, June of 1920.
And you were, like, not, you had several older siblings.
I have one older brother, 7 years older, and a sister 5 years older, neither of whom have been encumbered with any social conscience at all.
How do you explain your own beliefs then?
Encumbrance.
It has been. I don't understand why they aren't. I grew up, as I think most children of our, God, what's the word, station? Good God, I don't know. Anyway, there were servants in the house, and they brought me up. It was somebody black who fed me, who prepared the food, who bathed me, who put me to bed, to whom I turned if I scraped my knee. And there were 6 servants who changed around a lot, but John and the one I spoke of, the chauffeur, and his wife Louise were the constants. And there was a period from the time I was 6 until I was about 9 when I had a white governess, and that was difficult. The poor woman was neither fish nor fowl. It would have been rough. But I can't remember when I first noticed that the black people did all the work and the white people seemed to reap all the benefits. Beyond that, John and Louise lived in the basement. There was an apartment down there, and the ironing lady ironed in a room down in the basement. I liked it in the basement. It was warm. I certainly had never heard the word soul then, but they had it. There was a warmth, a caring that I knew I didn't have but wished I had. There was the great excitement of what the bug number was going to be because they all played the bug. But it was an admiration. I don't think there was ever any condescension there. I can't remember when I didn't feel that they knew a great deal that I didn't know.
Was this a secret from your family and friends, or?
can't remember that it ever was discussed. I used to trot around to all the kitchens in the neighborhood. I was known at all the back doors. And Mother was humiliated because when the people across the street would have a party, Cook would save me a plate of party food. Mother thought there was an implication there that I didn't get enough to eat at my house. And I was a very skinny child, and she's touchy about that.
Which neighborhood was this?
This was out in Druid Hills.
In Druid Hills, okay.
I lived on Springdale Road. And it was, as it happened, there were no children on the whole block who were my age. They were the same ages as my brother and sister, so I was fairly solitary. Can't remember ever feeling lonely about it, but I spent a lot of time with the help in the kitchen and the laundress next door. I was very fond of Eva. How much of a mark this had, I don't know, but by the time I was an early adolescent, Mother and I had a few set-tos about it.
Now, what kinds of things?
I can't remember. I think she must have said something condescending about Louise. And I snapped back that Louise had a better education than she did, which was true. Mother was convent trained, but she'd never gone to college, and Louise had. I don't know how far. Mother was, of course, very angry. Mother's incredible snobbery, and I don't know where it came from. As I said, that she was pretty quiet about her family. I don't know who they were. But it wasn't always a matter of color. I remember going to the grocery store. There was a butcher, Mr. Funderburg, and I was 13 or so, and I was talking to Mr. Funderburg, and I asked how his wife was. I'd heard she was sick, and he told me, and I asked about his children. Mother didn't say anything then, but as we left the store, she said, "You know, dear, it's all right to say good morning to Mr. Funderburg, but you really don't discuss his family. You must remember who you are." And I said, "But Mother, who am I?" And I never got an answer that made any sense to me at all. We just simply agreed not to discuss it after a while.
Did you go away for school, or did you stay?
I went to Washington Seminary, which was the antecedent of Westminster, and then I went to Vassar. And oh dear. Okay, well,
How did you come to choose Vassar?
I wish I could think up a really impressive intellectual reason for why I chose Vassar, but my brother had gone to Williams, and he had gone to Williams because my mother and father had really wanted him to go to Oxford, but he didn't want to go that far away because there was a girl here. He wanted to stay closer to...
Not Emory at Oxford, but
No, Oxford in England. And so they thought Williams College in Massachusetts somehow had an Oxonian atmosphere. They liked that. So my brother went to Williams, and he was, as I said, 7 years older than I. And he saw a lot of Vassar girls when he was at Williams, and he said, "You know, those girls are really smooth." That was the adjective of the day. He said, "Yeah, they might even really be able to do something for you, Monk." He called me Monk, short for monkey. And that is why I went to Vassar. I also had this simplistic belief that it was simply the best women's college in the country. And I wanted to go to a women's college because I wanted to be able to be as intelligent as I knew how to be. And I thought if I were in a class with boys, I would be too busy trying to be adorable to be intelligent. So,
Do you remember how you came to conclude that about a women's college? Had you heard women's colleges discussed?
no, I just knew there wouldn't be any men in my classes. That the arrangement was, and it worked out this way, that from Monday to Friday I thought, and from Saturday and Sunday I charmed, or tried to. It worked out very well.
So your family encouraged you, all the kids really, to go to colleges outside of Atlanta, outside of Georgia.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, there was my sister, the one in the middle, didn't choose to go to a college. She went to an art school in New York.
Do you have any sense of if the parents' expectations for you as opposed to your brother?
No. Being so much the youngest, I didn't have any sense of expectation at all. In fact, I think it probably would have been a shock to them to know that I would ever have done much except be a fairly pleasant little girl. They used to call me Sunshine because I was very, very happy all the time. And no, I had no sense of any expectation. If I may be perfectly honest, when you do things like this, do you let modesty get in the way, or you just remember whatever
Be
you remember?
perfectly honest.
When I was 9, the IQ test was discovered, and it was much, much narrower than it is now. In fact, all that it really required was a vocabulary and a certain degree of speed. So when I was in the 4th grade, the test was administered, and I had spent a great deal of my childhood reading. I read the encyclopedias, from Compton's encyclopedia particularly, and I did very well. And the principal called Mother in and said that I really should not probably be in a public school. I went to a public school through the 6th grade, and she made the mistake of telling Mother that according to the tests I was a genius. And it scared the living wits out of Mother, who thought that all geniuses were also crazy. So, as much as possible, I think, she sat on my brains. So there was certainly never any attempt to extend them. Whatever I learned on my own.
Yeah.
Were you told this at the time also, or did you just learn this?
No, I
after the
found
fact?
out later. I had noticed in school, obviously, that I picked things up very quickly. It wasn't until I got to Vassar that I found out that a nearly photographic memory should not be equated with a brain.
That's right.
I mean, I was, but until then, all the way through high school, the ability to regurgitate with accuracy was all I needed, so that my average in high school was something like 98, and I skipped a year on the way through. And
So-
I thought by the time I got to Vassar that nobody had ever been that smart before.
So you got to Vassar in 37?
That's right.
And well, what was your experience upon arrival on the campus, given this background and your own years?
It was a shock, and it was cold, both geographically and emotionally. I didn't really make many friends my freshman year. There was a girl who lived in the next room. We had single rooms, and she was from a small town in Pennsylvania and didn't know anybody else, so we became friends, but it was less because of anything in common than proximity.
Were there other Southern girls there?
Very few, almost none. There were 2 who had come from the same class I did at the seminary, but they were not people who'd been extremely good friends, and I didn't see them much at college. I'm not proud of any of this, but having made the jolting discovery that I was not the smartest girl in the world, or the smartest girl in my dormitory, or the smartest girl anywhere, I decided I might as well have a very good time. And there were boys I knew at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Williams and Amherst, and I was determined to hit every one of the campuses before I finished college. And I had been for all my high school years, so careful not to let it out that I read books, or that I thought, that it took me a while to realize it was all right to express myself in the vocabulary that came natural to me but that I'd never used. And I remember about halfway through freshman year, one of my classmates, a very, very bright girl who was there on scholarship, came over and she said, I have something here to, I think you might enjoy reading. She said, I've just realized, in spite of the way you talk, you're pretty bright. And she gave me a copy of the New Masses. She was our class communist.
That's funny. Did you experience any prejudice to you because you were Southern?
Yes, it was the first time that I had ever been a minority. It was, just making fun of the way I talked.
Mm-hmm.
And the South generally, they had their own ideas of what the South was like. It was during my freshman year, I guess, that one of the speakers who came to campus was Walter White, who was president of the NAACP. And I think I may have been taunted into going. I'm not sure I'd have gone because I was pretty, if you're going to be gone all weekend, you had to study sometime. And I didn't go to too many speeches. Looking back, I regret that I didn't hear Eleanor Roosevelt but once, because she was on campus constantly, with Hyde Park being right around the corner. But I did go to hear Walter White, and he was an appealing gentleman and an amazing speaker. And he mentioned that he was from Atlanta, and that there had been a race riot in maybe 1907, I'm not sure I've got my date right. And the blood he had seen running on Auburn Avenue, and he had said that he would never come back to Atlanta to live. I was stunned. I was shocked. I was apologetic. I went up to him afterward and I said, Mr. White, I'm from Atlanta, and I'd never heard anything about that race riot, but please give us another chance. I think we've improved a lot. And he was a sweet man, and he said, dear, I think they have a long way to go. I suggest when you finish college and go back, you see what you can do about it. And I think that was probably the real impetus.
Really?
Beyond that, I had not, before that, I knew there was something terribly wrong with the situation, but I had not thought what, if anything, I could do about it.
I think about the race riot in 1906, and you hadn't known about that
No.
at all. Had you known about the lynching of Leo Frank or other important events in Atlanta's history?
I had known about the lynching of Leo Frank because my family had been involved in a small way. I'm not sure I have the story straight, but as I heard it, my grandmother,
Your mother's?
no, my father's mother, she was a lady who cared a lot. She never raised her voice, but she did what needed to be done, and she decided that Leo Frank, whom she did not know at all, but that this just couldn't be. It didn't sound right. And she would go over to the jail and take him chicken soup. I'm not sure she ever got to meet him. But when the sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment, his mother, possibly his sister, I'm not sure of the detail, came down from Chicago to celebrate the great occasion. And the story I have heard, and I'd love to know if it's really true, is that my father had just acquired an automobile, and he and his parents picked up Mrs. Frank and this other one to take them out to ride. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they were going to celebrate. As they were driving out Peachtree Street, they saw a crowd of men walking toward town, probably right about in front of Governor Slayton's house.
Right.
And when they came back from the ride, they found out who the group of men was and what they were doing.
Was the mob out to lynch the governor?
They were going out to lynch.
Hmm.
And so that I heard about. I knew about Leo Frank.
What was that grandmother's last name or name?
Now that was Ida Schwab, or Ida Newell. That
Ida
was my
Newell
Jewish
Schwab, right,
grandmother,
that's
but
right.
I don't know, knowing what I know of her, I don't think the fact that Leo Frank was Jewish necessarily played a part in her concern. Because I kept hearing tales of grandmother and what she'd done. There was a fellow named John Malone who was a drunk, and his family had given up on him totally, and grandmother felt there was hope here, and she to dinner and generally, evidently, had something to do with his coming out of his alcoholism. And I never knew this until I was married, and as it happened, John Malone and his wife, much older than we, lived in our neighborhood. And he told me how much my grandmother had meant to him and what she had done for him. And incidentally, John Malone's sister was married to Bobby Jones.
Okay.
So,
In your parents' circle or in the people who you knew in Atlanta up until that time, and up through the late 30s, were there any people in the local liberal community that they had dealings with her?
not that I know of. The closest, they were friends of Ralph McGill's, but that I had the impression was less because of Ralph's political opinions than in spite of them. Because, of course, Ralph was a staunch Democrat, and I don't know if he and Daddy ever discussed politics.
He was just moving over from the sports page to...
Yeah, he was the editor by then, and he was interesting. He traveled a great deal, and when he'd come back from his trips, they would come over for dinner. This is a little off the subject, but years later when I met Barry Goldwater, I was at the time doing volunteer public relations for the Republican Party, and Ralph McGill was the first person to say that Barry Goldwater was a racist. And Goldwater was very concerned about this, and I think he had communicated with the Atlanta Party and hoped that some response should be made to this because he felt it was terribly unfair. He was one of the earliest members of the NAACP in Arizona. And when a public school in the area refused to integrate, this doesn't sound possible, but it's what he said, he bought it and integrated it.
The Goldwaters were pretty rich in
Yeah.
Arizona.
So he wanted some denial made on this. And I was selected to write a letter to the newspaper and straighten this out. Barry Goldwater came to town very briefly, and a group of us met with him out at the airport, and I was on the executive board for the state by then. You didn't have to be much to do that. There were only about 24 Republicans in the whole state. But he was talking about Ralph McGill and said he had always admired Ralph McGill. He said, you know, Ralph McGill was the best goddamn sports writer in the United States until he quit drinking, got religion, and went crazy.
What other kinds of experiences? It sounds like the Walter White speech was a real galvanizing
Yes.
kind of thing.
Well, Barry Goldwater's a galvanizing fellow in the opposite direction.
Right. Well, let's talk about sort of the 25 years in between.
Yes, between.
What other things did you gain from college?
Among other things, I took an economics course where we were asked to study the reports of the then hot issue, the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board, by reading the New York Times and the Daily Worker. And this was the first time I had ever known that not all newspapers said the same thing. And that to see something in print did not necessarily mean it was truthful. Tremendously important to me to learn that. Vassar had a theory, a little confusing sometimes, that economics could not be taught objectively. There was just no way a teacher could keep their own opinions out. So in order to give us what they hoped would be a balanced view of economics, the introductory course was taught by 6 teachers, each for a period of 6 weeks. And they ranged all the way from the head of the department, a Dr. Newcomer, who was an advisor to Eisenhower later on, was a Republican, to a Mrs. Norris, who was a pretty outspoken communist. We got all views in between and ended up with almost terminal confusion. We didn't have anything to draw on. So that was extremely thought-provoking to me, to have those people. And the English assignments, we were reading Thomas Wolfe, we were reading, French. Good God, I read French, and I read Proust in French. That is not a good way for me to read Proust. I finally got him in English and learned what he was saying. T.S. Eliot, a great deal of reading that nobody at Washington Seminary would ever have heard of.
What was your reaction to this modern literature?
I liked it. It really grabbed me a lot. I majored in botany for a crazy reason. It was a small course. There were very few people. I felt at home there. I was a little bit scared. Looking back, Vassar only had 1,200 students, and that's tiny by today's standards. But compared to the maximum of 16 people a class at Washington Seminary, where the teachers not only called me by my first name, but were likely to call me by Mama's first name because they had taught her too. To get up there and be Miss Schwab was terrifying. That's a very good name to hiss. So Vassar botany called me Nan, and in gratitude I majored in it. I think they were not very grateful to my gratitude because I had the most non-existent laboratory technique ever. It's no good.
Did you graduate from Vassar?
No, I didn't. I married at the end of my junior year. Britt had, we'd always known, we'd known for a lot of years we wanted to be married, and he had finished his master's degree and he had gotten a job with DuPont, and I had realized that, at the time at least, I would have to go at least a year and a half to any reputable college, no matter how long I'd gone to Vassar, in order to get a bachelor's degree. And our original plan was, he was in Philadelphia, that I would transfer to Bryn Mawr and finish up there. But I did not finish. I never did finish. And I was amazed later on. Well, that's another story, but I became the first vice president of Vassar's National Alumni, and I thought when they wrote me about this that they had the wrong person.
You were thinking that because you hadn't finished your degree, this couldn't happen.
Also, because I had certainly never set any academic woods on fire up there. I had people who were encouraging. The English department kept saying, you ought to be majoring in English, you should write. But I was cozy in the botany department, and in addition to that, if you majored in English, you had to focus almost exclusively on English, whereas in botany I was freer to spread out and take languages and some history I wanted.
Was there something about a science degree that appealed to you? Was it anything in the nature of the study that you liked?
The whole thing was a mistake, I think. I loved flowers. I had always loved flowers. I thought botany was about flowers. It wasn't. When I got into it, I realized that there might be a career there in the unlikely event I ever had to earn a living. And it hadn't occurred to me then that I would. But I majored within the botany department in plant pathology, with the idea that I could go to maybe work for the Department of Agriculture in the development of what now turns me green, pesticides or herbicides or.
That's interesting. That was just right on the horizon at that time too.
Mm-hmm. Among the things we did was to culture in an agar plate the spores of penicillium, with the idea of trying to figure out how to kill this stuff because it turned bread blue. Not very ethical. And so I killed lots of penicillium. And later on we found that Dr. Fleming in England had already discovered what penicillin as he named it, would do.
That's funny.
So I went back, and I don't know if you're familiar with the thing in Beyond the Fringe, which we have memorized the whole
Beyond
thing.
the Fringe, I don't-
Beyond the Fringe is a British humor group, but one of them is the fellow who is a miner, and he's saying he would like to have been a judge, but that he didn't have the Latin for the judging, but he said that he had the feeling that it wasn't that he didn't know anything, it was just all the knowledge he had was absolutely useless. Well, when I found out about Dr. Fleming and penicillium, I decided most of my botanical knowledge was useless.
I wondered about the interest in science, given your later interest in environmental issues, but those are completely unrelated, it
I
sounds like.
think they are. I think that I had, as a child, had a very small wilderness. I think the backyards on Springdale Road continued to be wooded at the very back. The lot was an acre, and it was fairly narrow and deep, and our neighbors had the same situation. So I wandered around in that little backyard wilderness as a child and loved every flower and every tree and every critter I saw without knowing why. I just felt this was where I belonged.
Now, you and Britt had known each other since you were kids?
No, I was 14 when we met.
Uh-oh. You sound like you remember very precisely.
Yeah, pretty well. And he was 17, and I went to a dance. He remembers that better than I do, in Margaret Bryan's dancing school. I wish I could say that I had had enough sense to see immediately that this was it. I didn't. I liked him a lot, but it was rather slow to develop. So we married when I was 19,
But you
almost 20.
Kept in touch with him all the time that you
Oh,
were
yeah.
at Bassman?
Mm-hmm. I wrote every day.
And he had gone to school where? Here at Georgia Tech or where?
Yes, he went to Georgia Tech, and then he got his master's degree at Emory. He was one of 4 sons, all hitting college age in the middle of the Depression, and they did well to get them there. There was no question of their going away to school.
Uh-huh.
And what did he study and get his master's in?
Well, he studied textile engineering with his bachelor's because he wanted to stay in the South, and discovered, as I did about botany, that I wasn't really very smart, because the people who were taking textiles, who had jobs waiting for them, were folks whose parents owned the mills. It was a disastrous time of year.
Right, sure.
Oh, he graduated in 38, I guess. And there simply were no jobs.
Right.
He got a fellowship to do his master's at Emory in organic chemistry because he'd had a minor in chemistry. And he later didn't really practice either one of them, although his first job was as a research chemist for DuPont.
So he moved to Philadelphia or
Mhm.
Wilmington or?
Philadelphia was where the paint laboratory was, and that's what he was involved in.
And you were there a fairly short amount of time? Is that
Just
right?
1 year. Most endless year of my entire life. I didn't do very well with Philadelphia.
It was just,
It wasn't home. I loved Britt, and I was happy because he was there, but beyond that, it was extremely lonely. We lived in a neighborhood filled with middle-aged people. I didn't know anybody else my age. And at the end of a year, it was 1940, 1941, early 41, and Britt had a naval commission from the Naval ROTC at Tech.
Right.
He said he never thought about refusing to do that. You just hadn't thought.
Sure.
It was, did you want Army ROTC or did you want Navy ROTC? So he had an ensign's commission. And then when they actually called him,
After Pearl Harbor.
no, before
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, it would have been, maybe January or February of 1941. He realized that he was a conscientious objector. It had taken him a while to get there. We've discovered since then, talking to people, that very few conscientious objectors are born. Most of them arrive at it gradually. And his original thought was that, well, maybe he could serve in the Navy, but in a non-competent sort of way, as an engineer on a ship or something. And the Navy didn't like that idea at all. You could not place any limitations on your serving. So he said, then I cannot serve at all. And they did a little grumbling and threatening, 10 years in Leavenworth if you keep with this. And he did not back away, so they discharged him with cause, which is not a dishonorable discharge. And then later, anticlimactically enough, it turned out he was 4F anyway because of asthma.
Oh. But did that prompt you all to
That
contact
prompted
the Quakers in Philadelphia?
I wish we had, but no, we didn't. I wasn't terribly aware of what the Quakers were doing until we got back to Atlanta. And at that point, well, when he opted out of the Navy, we had already left the DuPont job and didn't want to go back to that. Wanted to come to Atlanta if we could. Came to Atlanta, and I'm not sure how we found the American Friends Service Committee, but we did. And began to devote energies to them. I have a little clipping back from 1941 in the paper saying that I'm collecting food and clothing for both sides in the hostility.
Who was involved in the AFSC in Atlanta in 1941, for God's sake?
Gosh, I don't remember the names anymore. I should. There's a man named Noyes Collinson who was involved at some point. I'm not at all sure they had a professional staff here. I think it unlikely that they did. There were just a few people who would get together and meet. And the first, funny, if we became involved with them because of the pacifist orientation, and that is why, when we got in we found out there was also interracial, which is something else we'd been searching for.
In Atlanta in the 40s.
In Atlanta in the early 40s. We met at the YWCA, which was the only place that would allow such heretical goings on. And I remember the first meeting that I ever went to with black people on an equal basis was just, maybe there were 20 of us, I don't know. But I remember, too, that although I had done most of the talking about a belief in absolute equality, I was very uneasy. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to communicate with black people. Whereas a couple of the people were chemistry professors at Atlanta University, and Britt got along just fine.
Interesting. I've heard lots of people talk about that first encounter,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in an interracial setting, and how it was a jolt.
It was really strange because, of course, I'd grown up with black people all my life in the closest possible way, but always with a servant-employer relationship.
I think about the YWCA as really one of the, in the 40s, one of the out front organizations on
They
changing racial
definitely
myths.
were. It was so far as I know, the only place when you consider black churches, yes, but no white churches.
Did you know about this interest, this aspect of the WISE program before going to this meeting, or was this all
No.
an introduction?
It was all an introduction. I knew nothing about it at all. I did not know some ladies, a Mrs. Tilley, I think. who
Dorothy
I-
Tilley, Mrs. M.E. Tilley.
I think I may have met her once, but I didn't know her well at all.
So she was involved in this.
Yeah, I
relief effort,
understand
too.
that Mrs. No, I don't know that she was AFSC. I
But
just
with the
remember
Y.
hearing her about the Y.
I was thinking there's another man who I think later was with Fellowship of Reconciliation, Claude Nelson, who was something of a dissident in the Methodist Church in Decatur, but you never came across
No,
him.
that I never. I didn't know about the FOR for
Right, but
a
I
good
think
many years.
Eventually he went with FOR, and around that time was kind of an outcast in the Decatur Methodist Church because of his views, but you didn't cross paths.
No, I don't even remember hearing his name.
Did you, Mrs. Tilley is one example of a generation older than you,
Yes.
who was very involved in changing racial matters. Do you recall meeting or hearing about any other women of a generation older than you?
Well, later I got to know some, and I'm trying to remember. Because Ida Patterson was,
Church Women United?
yeah, Church Women United, and she was a great lady. But primarily, I think I came to know them later on when Hope started.
Oh, really? What about people like Josephine Wilkins?
Yeah, and Josephine Wilkins I had met, I guess, must have known her before Hope. League of Women Voters, maybe. I think she was active in the state league.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she was.
And looking back, that group must have been looking for somebody young to follow them, because shortly after I met Josephine Wilkins, she invited me to come to lunch. And she lived in the Biltmore in an apartment. And I was grateful to the league, and I'm sure that's where I met her, for my first real relationship with people a generation older. Because I hadn't really known anybody except mother's friends, and they were mother's friends, and that was it.
She invited you into the League of Women Voters.
Well, I think I probably had joined it on my own, but once having met me at a meeting there or been in a discussion group, she asked me to come to lunch.
Do you recall how you heard of the work the League was doing?
No, it was, it was fairly well known. It would have been written up in the newspaper. And I had decided that if I were going to change things, I would have to do it politically. And that I knew very little of how the political system worked, and that the League was the place to learn. And it was. I became a board member of the League, and that's the most demanding job I've ever had. You couldn't bluff it with the League. And it will probably be clear the more I talk that I have a surface knowledge of a great many things. I think I have a facility. I am not a deep soul. It is hard for me to dig and be certain that I am accurate in what I'm doing or to go into details, but because of the League I had to learn.
I understand that at that time a lot of League women carried, I even think they called them portfolios, so they were assigned a certain research item to
Yes.
know about and report on. Did you have one of those?
Yes, urban housing, and way ahead of time, and nothing happened for a long time. But my concern was upgrading slums.
This is when you came back in the 40s.
Yeah, that would have been in the 40s.
In that capacity, would you ever have had any dealings with somebody like Bob Thompson of the Urban League, who later became quite an expert in housing?
Not then. I
Or
think
Charles Palmer?
Well, Chuck Palmer I knew because his daughter was my best friend.
From growing up years?
Yes,
Okay.
at Washington Seminary. His daughter wore my wedding dress.
And what's her name?
Her name was Margaret Palmer, and she died relatively recently. She married a man from Kansas, and she met when she was in Randolph-Macon and never came back to Atlanta to live. Margaret was, even in high school, an odder girl out than I was.
Another thing I'm interested in with the League is its nonpartisan stance, but did you find it to be equally welcoming of Democratic and Republican women in the 40s?
I was just about the token Republican. I don't think they made any rules, it just came out that way. And eventually that was what led me to resign from the board. I mean, I don't know whether I resigned or my term was up and I didn't run again. But this would have been just when Eisenhower was getting ready to run, and I wanted very much to be active in the political process, and as a board member I could not. I was forbidden to be anything other than strictly nonpartisan.
I know you back to the Republicans. Well, so coming back to Atlanta in 1941 or 2,
Yeah.
you joined the League right away.
Yeah, I think I probably joined the Republicans just
That's
about
the
as
next
quickly,
question.
and that didn't matter until I was on the board of the League, and then I could no longer serve on. As a matter of fact, I probably could have been on the board of the League at the same time I served on the executive committee for the Republican Party, but I could not overtly support a Republican candidate. It was a fine line there.
Right. Let's talk about.
I'm gonna,
Okay.
just one more thing on the early years with the League of Women Voters. My sense is that the League was quite welcoming of Jewish women, and I
Yes.
wondered if you found that to be true also.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there was ever any question about that. One of the big mover and shaker was a woman named Mrs. Leonard Has, B. Has.
Right.
And I, gosh, is B still
She's
living?
still living. She's 85-ish or so.
Well, she was tremendous. She was a neighbor. They lived behind us on Oakdale. Wonderfully attractive lady. Had gone to Wellesley, I think. And I can remember going to a sort of a small study group of the League when I first began to be involved, and sitting next to B and commenting on something to her that had been said, and she immediately raised her hand for recognition and got it. And she said, Nan was just saying to me, what was it you were saying, Nan? And there I was. First public utterance. Terrified. But that was how I happened to say whatever it was I said, and found, God help us all, the wonderful sense of power that here these people were listening to me. But no, B was a leader. I think another woman was a Mrs. Hyman.
Josephine
Joseph-
Hyman, Margaret MacDougall.
Yeah, and Margaret MacDougall, she was wonderful. But I was thinking of the
Jewish,
Jewish ladies. I
Joe
think
Hyman
B
was,
and Joe Hyman were.
Rebecca Gershon.
Yeah, I think she was, but I don't remember meeting her until years later. Not aware of any anti-Semitism growing up. It may have been here, but Atlanta had very, very few Jewish families in those days, and they were the German Jews who were very cultured and had brought to Atlanta the first symphony orchestra, I think, the first real appreciation of art. Atlanta was a brawling frontier town. And the Jewish families, the Hazes, the Elsases,
Hirsch's.
yeah, the Hirsches, were extremely intelligent and, so far as I know, not discriminated against. Maybe I'm dreaming. But Washington Seminary, where I went to school, I do not remember any Jewish girls in my class. I don't know why this was.
Did you have any sense at all of yourself being part Jewish at that time? Or?
Not really. When I got to be about 15, there was a very strict social arrangement in Atlanta. There were high school sororities, and there were high school fraternities, and there were dancing schools, and you went to the same ones. And I think when I was about 14, I suddenly realized, oh my goodness, my father is Jewish, or part Jewish. Does that make me? Will I get in a sorority? But my brother had blazed the trail ahead of me by being in one of the fraternities, and I worried for a month or so before the first rush week, and then it all went away because I was a Sigma Delta, and I went on to be asked to make my debut, and there wasn't. And yet I do remember, not with any pride, that on the rare occasions when my parents would have Jewish friends for dinner or something, and I had a date, I would meet my date at the door and get out of there. I did not particularly want my friends to meet these people, although I liked them personally and I'd known them all my life. But if it were, on the other hand, if it was the Healy's or John O. Childs, then come right in and meet my family and meet these people. I was prejudiced, I guess. In fact, later on, Britt would laugh at me when after we were married, we'd go to the symphony, and at intermission, he said, if you go batting all the way across the floor to talk to some old person, I know it's somebody Jewish. You're always atoning. And he was absolutely right. I was so afraid somebody had read my mind and known that at some point I was ashamed of this.
So at the time that you're describing right now, you're more aware of your attitudes about race than
Yes.
about religion.
Yeah, religion, it didn't mean anything at all. I just, and I couldn't remember any. I was not aware that in other parts of the United States there were anti-Catholic feelings, for instance.
Do you want to do the Republican?
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the League in the 40s. I mean, you became the expert you had your portfolio on urban housing.
Yeah.
What other things did you get involved with, or was the League involved with that you can recall?
I was sort of the perennial fundraiser, and that took a great deal of time. The budget was on my shoulders, and I would go to call on the presidents of the banks and the presidents of the department stores and ask them to make their contributions to the League, and they usually did.
Did you do any of the monitoring of the legislature?
Yes, I did some, found it very confusing, still do. But the League made me think, I think probably harder than Vassar did. And I was grateful for somewhere where I could do this. I also felt about as humble as a League member as I ever will. I knew less than the others. I was a lot younger, but I still knew a lot less.
I was going to say, I think of people like Josephine Wilkins or Francis Pauli, for that matter, others
Yeah.
who were in the League in the 40s. Were there other recruits, new members like yourself?
There was a woman named Mary Jean Bird from Florida who no longer lives here. Margot Neely, who has died. Her husband was Dr. Levering Neely. Trying to think who on the board.
Did Eliza Pascal come in at the same time to the League as you did?
I think maybe Liza was there first. I'm not sure. Eliza was maybe a few years older than I and had been a leader from the time she was at Agnes Scott on. So yes, I think Liza was involved.
And I guess a little bit later, after the war, Jane Abram.
Yeah, because Jane was a neighbor as well and remains a friend. I'd like to see Jane oftener than I do.
why don't we switch to the Republican Party for a while? Because I'm real interested in, you said you joined for different reasons than your father did.
Yeah. I joined because along with the YWCA, the Republican Party was the only integrated public organization in the state of Georgia. The only place where we met together. And at the time it was far more democratic in its choosing of its, for instance, the delegates to the National Convention. The Democratic Party was the white primary. It was the very essence of bigotry, and I didn't look beyond that. I never looked to see. I knew who Talmadge was and what he was about. And so at the time that I became active with the Republican Party, Elbert Tuttle was the state chairman, and Randolph Thrower was involved, and these were marvelous people whom I admired then and continue to admire now, people of integrity and tremendous intelligence and patience. Of course, looking back, it's sort of funny, because when we actually had an election coming up, it was almost relaxing to know you didn't have a prayer of winning it. So you were free to nominate somebody really great, but you knew that the newspaper would virtually ignore it. You'd usually get one pat on the head editorially. Of course, they haven't got a prayer, but this is a nice man. But that was as far as it got. But there was a black fellow named John Calhoun. Have you ever met Calhoun? Well, speaking of patting on the head, he thought we were all of us from Elbert Tuttle down impossibly naive. We didn't really know what it was all about.
Well, he had spent some time in Chicago with ward politics in Chicago, I think. And
I didn't know that. I only knew that, looking back on it, it wasn't that flagrant at the time, that we were probably finding enough money to pay Calhoun to buy a respectable number of votes in the black community.
Give some specifics of why you say that about Calhoun and his attitude about you all.
Well, it was just quite obvious. He was a member of the board, and he would sit and listen to us go on about our concerns, but then later when Calhoun spoke, it rarely had any relationship to what we'd been talking about at all. It had to do with getting out the vote, which had to do with paying a certain amount of money to do things. He was a funny fellow. Every time I heard Amos and Andy and heard the Kingfish, I thought about Calhoun.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Who were some of the other blacks that you met through the Republican Party in the 40s?
Mr. Yates.
Clayton Yates.
And a man named Blayton, I believe.
J.B. Blayton.
They were the business elite. I also got to know the Scott family well, the Atlanta Daily World Scott people, because my job in the Republican Party was to do public relations, and I'd write articles for the Daily World.
Oh, you actually wrote for the Daily
Yeah, I
World
actually wrote. I mean, I'd hand them in, and sometimes they had no byline at all. Sometimes they had a staff byline. They certainly never had mine.
Was the world Republican in the 40s? Because I had thought they only turned Republican with the Eisenhower election.
No, my understanding is they
before.
had been Republican since Lincoln. That was the basis of it all. They were still the party of emancipation.
Well, what about John Wesley Dobbs?
I did not know him. I wish I had. And of course, I know East Maynard's grandpapa, but I didn't know him.
But he's talked about as being a big poobah in the.
Oh, he
Republican-
definitely was. He was, what was it, the Negro Voters League? I
One
think
of
he
the
founded.
Co-chairs.
But what about Benjamin Davis Sr.? Is he still on the scene at that time, or had
No, I don't remember that name.
Bill
at all.
Shaw?
Mm-mm.
No.
Funny.
Were there people from the Atlanta University complex who were Republicans, or was that more of a Democratic bastion?
I think that was more of a Democratic bastion. I can't remember when I got to know Dean Murphy, Josephine Murphy,
Right.
but she was my first entree into the Atlanta University system at all. Up until that point, I don't remember meeting any, so they must not have been Republican.
How did you meet her?
Very roundabout. My brother and his wife used to go to Sun Valley to ski. There was a Swiss gentleman who had a restaurant in Sun Valley. They got to know him. He wrote to my sister-in-law and said, I have a friend from South Africa who is coming to Atlanta to lecture at Atlanta University on social anthropology. I've taken the liberty of giving her your name because I don't know anybody else in Atlanta. Perhaps you would have her to tea or something. So my sister-in-law called me in a total panic and said, I don't know who this woman is or anything about her. I certainly don't think I'd better plan to take her over to the driving club. How about coming over to have tea with me? And her name was Ellen Hellman. And so I went over, and Dr. Ellen Hellman was properly white and of British background and Jewish, I think. And my sister-in-law had said, you don't have enough sense to shut up whether you know anybody or not, but I'm scared to talk to an anthropologist. So I liked Ellen very well. I wanted to know about her life. She was from Johannesburg. She was obviously one of the few people speaking out then. So after we had tea, I drove her back to Atlanta University, and she was staying with Dean Murphy. And I met Dean Murphy and told her that this was the first time in my life I had ever been on the campus and how eager I was to meet them and know something about it. And she said, well, there's a group called the Council on Human Relations, the Georgia Council. Would you like to know about them? And I grabbed onto that and joined the Georgia Council. So Ellen Hellman and I corresponded for quite a few years after she got back to Johannesburg. And she wrote of how difficult it was. And then when I didn't hear from her for a while, I began to panic. I didn't know whether somebody had come to get her or not. And I wrote to Nadine Gordimer with the thought that Nadine would know her, that the two of them would be a small group. And she wrote back and said, I wish to heaven I'd had enough sense to save the letter, saying yes, she did know Ellen, and that Ellen was not well, that she was getting very old, but that so far as she knew, nobody had harassed her that she was there.
What year did this meeting take place in Atlanta?
Boy, I wish I could remember.
I think the Council on Human Relations was formed in '56, so was it just before that?
No, it must have been after that,
After.
because the council was formed by the time I got there. Whitney Young was the
Right.
head of it. And Liza Pascal was
Right.
very active, and Frances Polly.
Right.
So this was in the late '50s.
Yeah, it would have been in the late 50s. And this is what's incredible, that I had come home in 41 looking for some way to get a crack in the door, and that's the first one I really found.
And what do you attribute that to?
Hmm?
What do you attribute that
Well,
to?
there just were no cracks in the doors. There was no place where you could relate, no place you could meet. There were two very separate worlds here. I think, looking back on it, that there must have been as many black PhDs in Atlanta then as there were white ones. So it wasn't a matter of intelligence. It was just that there was no relationship there. But from the very beginning, I felt warmly welcomed in the black community.
I was going to say, what was the response of those to whom you eventually did seek contact and
They were wonderfully friendly and warm and sympathetic. I may have told you the Whitney Young story when we were trying to integrate something, and the only law we had then was the interstate commerce.
SEC, right?
So we could work on trying to integrate the facilities at the airport or at the bus station. And we were not getting very far. We would send a small group, 2 or 3 whites and 2 or 3 blacks, to talk to whatever board was administering it. None of them would ever say, oh no, we're never going to do that. They'd all say, sounds like a fine idea, and we're going to. We'll be having a meeting, we will discuss this. And this went on for months and months. And I, of course, was plagued by a guilty conscience along with the usual need to do something. And one day, Whitney came back from a meeting somewhere out of state in time for our meeting, and he said, I've got something to report. I think I have real progress at the Atlanta airport. This was the old one. I said, what? He said, well, you know that the sign on the door that used to say colored men? Well, the C and the ED have faded, and nobody's bothered to repaint them. It simply says Olor men. Do you think we could look on that as gradual integration? And I had to laugh, but Whitney was very much aware of how the rest of us felt. He was a tremendous loss. Gosh, I mean, he died so young, and there was so much potential there.
I have one other topic before we continue on this this aspect more of desegregation, and Cliff, you might have another one. But I'm thinking back in the mid-1940s, particularly in the first few months of 1946, there was a large voter registration drive in the black community. And I'm wondering, because of your connections with the Republican Party, were you aware that that effort was going on?
Yes, we knew it was going on, and totally in favor of it, because at the time the blacks voted at least 95, well, the first Eisenhower vote was literally 95% Republican among the black community. I don't know that the Republicans contributed any funds to the drive, but they were certainly wholeheartedly behind it.
What about the Helen Mencken campaign for Congress in the 5th District?
I barely remember that. I knew she was there. And in fact, I'm going to show my ignorance, but did she run against Davis?
Yeah.
Then I would have worked for her if I could have, because I really loathed Mr. Davis.
Would you ever jump party and work for, say, Baxter Jones or Morris Abram when they ran against Jim Davis in 52 and 54?
Yes. I voted for them. I couldn't work real loud, but I certainly was in favor of them. Baxter was an extremely good friend and was our personal lawyer as well.
Uh-huh.
Morris, this is funny the way things have turned out.
Yeah.
Morris and I could not discuss politics because I was so much more conservative than Morris was. He was a complete statist. He thought the federal government could handle everything better than anybody else. I remember on one occasion when we'd had dinner together, standing out there on those back steps arguing until 2 in the morning. And yet, I think I've stayed where I was, and Morris has gone way past me and is so conservative that we could no longer talk.
I want to talk a couple of things about electoral politics again. Did you go to any of the conventions yourself, the national conventions?
Not the national ones. I went to the state ones. I was asked to be actually the state committee woman in 1952, but couldn't do so because I was, as usual, expecting a baby any minute. So that was the one I would have got to, but I never got there.
That was the famous one where there was the Taft delegation
Yes.
and the Eisenhower delegation.
Yes. Oh, much excitement. I had worked very hard for the Eisenhower one. In fact, I was one of the 17 who had signed the original charter asking Eisenhower to run from the state.
Tell me, I know something about that. I know about the floor fight credentials fight at the convention. And,
Yeah.
But what happened before that point in terms
Well,
of the two
before
delegations?
that, we in Georgia had split on it, and the thing was that the Republican Party had always been open to anybody who walked in the door. Anybody could come to the convention. Anybody could vote. You didn't have to be a card-carrying member. And there was no question at all that most of the Republicans, and there were so few of us, were all excited about Eisenhower. But there were some old line fellows, mostly from North Georgia.
The post office.
Yeah,
Republicans.
post office crowd who had come, and they showed up at the convention, and even though, as I recall, we had outvoted them numerically, they insisted that they were the true Republicans and we were all newcomers. So that was how Georgia happened to send 2 delegations, and the decision to accept the Eisenhower delegation was the first indication at the convention as to which way it was going. And
I gathered Judge Tuttle was quite involved in all of that.
yes, I think he was probably the head of our Eisenhower delegation.
I saw a reference actually that there was a similar fight in 1948 between the so-called Lily White Republicans and the integrated group. Do you recall anything
No,
about that?
now that I should have, but I don't. That would have been 4 years before.
Yeah, I just
I
saw,
didn't know there were any Lily White Republicans.
Well, it was Judge Tuttle who branded them
Mhm.
Lily White Republicans in 1948, and I saw a reference in the newspapers to that.
Well, was terribly involved in this Eisenhower thing. I've never been so excited about anything, and as I said, very pregnant. And Blair was due, I think, on about July 15th, and she was our 5th child, and they'd all been late. But July 11th was the day of the convention, and I got so hysterical. I actually had a baby 4 days early. I expected him to put her in an incubator.
It's a good thing you didn't name him Ike.
Yeah. Well, the thing was, I had planned to name a son Dwight. I was that far gone. But I wasn't crazy enough to name a girl Mamie. So
What appealed to you so much about Eisenhower?
well, I liked his background was actually peaceful. His family were, I can't remember, the Brethren or something. They were not Quakers, but they were closely related. I was convinced that, well, he said that he had gone to West Point because it was a free college education. And I thought that he was one of the warriors who really had got close enough to hate war, that he was more likely to be able to stand up to the military and to speak out against them than anybody else, because who can argue with a 5-star general? And it was, of course, he who labeled the military-industrial complex and told us to be careful. So he was not a perfect man, but of all my political idols, and they get fewer and fewer, he has stood the test of time probably better than most. After all, he sent the troops down to Little Rock.
In the Civil Rights Act of '57.
Mm-hmm.
This makes me think, too, I wonder, despite being a Republican, what did you think about Franklin Roosevelt?
Nothing quotable, but I said already. You know, both my parents and Brett's were just frothed at the mouth at the sight of this man. And my father, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, had a representative from almost every industry, I guess, and my father was the NRA person for the bedding industry.
Okay.
And he would have to go to Washington and talk to Harry Hopkins, and he'd always come home and say, "My God, if I tried to run a business like that, we'd be bankrupt in a year. That's horrible." Of course, it never occurred to me for several decades that a government is not like a business. I could tell Ross Perot there. They do not have the same function at all. But at the time I couldn't see that. They were efficient or they were not efficient, and the government was not efficient. Also, Vassar had intensified my feelings about Roosevelt, because Dutchess County, where Vassar and Hyde Park was, never once went for Roosevelt all those years. They saw him as a total aristocrat who'd never really worked for a living himself and who really didn't care anything about the working man but just made a lot of noise. And there doesn't seem to be much doubt that he was the consummate politician who could make everybody who talked to him emerge from the meeting feeling he's on my side. So I about my first political act was that when I was in the 7th grade, he came to town, and I threw a wild onion at the car. It didn't hit it, but I felt better.
So even through the 30s and 40s, you wouldn't have thought much of his social programs?
No, they weren't working, for one thing, and there was a terrible fear that these social programs were galloping socialism. They would put the bedworks out of business.
Do you remember, I think I mentioned this to you before, do you recall any of the strikes that ever took place at the, or organizing drives at the bed factory?
I was 12, I think, so it would have been 1932 when the CIO attempted to organize Southern Spring Bed Company. There were at the time about 800 employees. According to my father, and admittedly I heard only one side of this, what was holding up a decision on this was that he was forbidden by the Wagner Act to even talk to the strikers or to any of their representatives. And so he couldn't say, my objection, I don't mind your organizing, but I will not submit to the checkoff system. And I don't know if they called it the checkoff system then, but the idea, of course, was that he should withhold their union dues. And he said, if they want to do that, all right, but I will not do that. And I don't know how long the strike dragged on. It seemed interminable to me, and it was filled with bloody violence. I think there may have been several murders. And I remember Dad going out to the factory while the strike was on, and my mother's fear that something would happen to him. But he's driving up and parking his car and walking into his office through a line of strikers, none of whom did anything. He was very proud of the fact that he knew every man in the factory by name, that they knew him, and he was definitely a hands-on manager. He was an engineer, and he went in and out of the factory, and he designed some of the machines, and he had a tremendous respect for the working people and a real hurt that he recognized this strike was hurting them far more than it was him. He worried about them being hungry. But it was not until a long time later, really, when Britt was part of management out there, that I realized that although my father loved his workers and felt that he was a benevolent boss, that they had never had paid vacations until they did organize. Incidentally, they did not organize as a result of that strike. They decided not to. But maybe a couple of years later they did. So that by the time I was grown and knew anything about it, the CIO was there. It was a very traumatic time, and my father was a very strong-minded fellow, and he believed with all his heart that he was taking care of his workers and that these union people would bleed them.
I've heard, I think, of one episode involving a black delivery man who came in during the strike and was fired at by some people on the picket line. Do you recall anything?
I didn't know that much detail, but I knew there was blood, and it was, as I said, I was 12, so I was aware, but not of any great details about it. It was. My father felt that the factory was his, you know.
Why don't we move further on at the time? We mentioned something that triggered my thought about that.
Do you have anything more on Republicans?
Well, let's move into the 50s, into sort of a broad constellation of organizations that you were involved with that, in one way or another, were dealing with the issue of desegregation.
Well, there weren't all that many. I think that, so far as I can recall, the Council on Human Relations. Then, I suppose through that, I became a member of the board of the Urban League and had the great privilege of working with Grace Hamilton, a wonderful, wonderful lady. And that's mostly where I knew Mr. Blayton. I mentioned his name, but it may be that he was not a Republican. It might have been Urban League. And I knew, all of a sudden a name has eluded me. Who's Atlanta Life?
Well, was it the Herndon family back then?
No, it was the
Jesse Hill.
Jesse Hill. I got.
Was he on the scene? He had come on the scene.
Yes, I knew Jesse through. I guess he was in the Urban League too. I also served on the board of the NAACP, and Julian Bond was our constant chairman.
Later on.
Yeah, I think he may have been when I first got on there. I can't remember. I guess he wasn't. A man named Lorenzo Ben.
Right.
So by this time, I knew all these people, and I knew Attorney Hollowell, and I knew the sort of work he was doing. And bless his heart, he still remembers me because Mark decided that he wanted to write a book about Thurgood Marshall. And he thought maybe, he called me and said, any way I can get in touch with him. And I said, maybe Mr. Hollowell. I called Hollowell, who didn't have any real way. He said he contacted him through the Supreme Court. But he would be glad to write a letter and say that Mark was the son of an old friend of his. But then Mark backed away from that one, mostly because he read that Thurgood Marshall said he absolutely did not want a book written about him.
I've been actually barking up some of the same trees myself.
Oh.
Going back to when we were talking about the Council on Human Relations and that being the first organization that you were able to find to work on some of these issues. And if my sense of timing is right, the League of Women Voters would have been going through its own desegregation crisis at this time, because that took place in 1956. Now you left for Eisenhower. Did you come back to the League of Women Voters?
I
later
was
on?
definitely a member of the League at the time. I simply was not on the board.
Well, what do you
But I
call
was
it?
at the meeting at the Women's Club where the thing came up, and I was quoted in the newspaper as being in favor of the integration of the League and questioning how it could have ever failed to be integrated in the first place.
Somewhat related to that, I saw a reference that actually back in 1946, there had been at least a discussion when you were on the board about the possibility of eliminating the word white from the bylaws. So do you remember that earlier discussion 10 years before the actual desegregation took place?
I remember it vaguely, and I remember being totally in favor of removing it, but it just never got very far. I don't know what happened. It just died. And at the time that there was the big squabble, the president of the League was a Mrs. Murdoch Equin, who had never belonged in the League in the first place. She we all used to think that she simply had an idea that she wanted to be the president of every women's organization in Atlanta before she quit, and this was one of them. She was much more at home as president of the Junior League.
Well, could you describe what happened at that meeting? Because I understand it was sort of came down to a showdown at
It
that
did.
time in
It absolutely
56.
came down to a showdown at the meeting. I wish, doggone, I think I ought to still have the clipping about it, but I'm afraid I don't. It's out at Emory if I do have it. But it was very dramatic. We were all sitting there in the auditorium of the Old Women's Club, and ordinarily the annual meeting of the league was cut and dried and deadly. But in this case, I wish I could remember names, but I'm sure that Margaret McDougall would have been on the right side, possibly leading it. I don't recall that we had any plans at all. We knew what we wanted, but nobody had said, you say this and I'll say that. Nor do I remember precisely what I said. I just asked to be recognized and may have been introduced as a former board member, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, I spoke in favor, and the eventual vote seems to me pretty lopsided in favor of integration.
I think that is the case.
I remember being disappointed before that because I had expected the National League to take us off the hook. I wanted the National League to say, you must integrate or get out of the league, but they didn't do it. They left the decision to us to make. And it was so crazy. Blacks had the vote. How could we call ourselves women voters and not allow anybody who could vote, not encourage anybody who could vote to come?
Had you ever heard of an organization called the League of Negro Women Voters?
No, I did not know there was any such thing. But I guess was that before our league integrated?
It was formed here in Atlanta in 1951 by a woman named Ruby Blackburn.
Just vaguely familiar name. I don't.
I just thought you would have continued some of the league things. I forgot some things, but why don't we go on?
In terms of do you recall who first introduced the motion or the idea of integrating the league? I have a sense that it might have come from the state level, so the Georgia League and through Francis Pauley.
I think it might have been Francis Pauley. I'm not sure. Francis herself could tell you, but I wish I could say it had begun with me. It didn't, but I enthusiastically joined in as soon as I knew it was happening.
And at the time that this was going on, was it clear to you that this aspect of desegregating the league was tied in with all the other issues involving desegregation at the time? So golf courses and
Yes, it did, but it seemed to me infinitely more important than golf courses. Sometimes I couldn't understand why a particular issue was joined, and golf courses always kind of amazed me. It was strange the way things were sometimes achieved. When I was on the Human Relations Board, we were engaged in conferring with the Atlanta Library Board because the libraries were desegregated, were segregated, which seemed to me the essence of idiocy and injustice and everything else. I can't remember how many meetings Whitney and I and a couple of others would go to talk to the library board, who were a volunteer group of good citizens, and who particularly said, yes, we're taking this under consideration. But I do remember that it was a Saturday night when Whitney called me and said, I don't know whether a particular incident had impelled him or what, but he said, we're going to file suit. We've messed around with this long enough. And just tell your friends on the board we're going to file suit. So I called George Goodwin, who was the person I knew best, and told him this was coming up, that the suit would be filed on Monday. And he said, give us until Wednesday. We'll have a meeting. And so on Wednesday they voted to desegregate. But it was at the threat of a lawsuit.
And wasn't it like the downtown branch, but not the Uncle Remus branch or something like that?
I didn't know that. I knew particularly the downtown branch had been where we had focused.
Because I think the Uncle Remus branch, being in a transitional residential neighborhood, was potentially more explosive than the downtown branch, or, you know.
I didn't know that. I just remembered that we had focused on the downtown branch, and that the plan before then had been, of course, that if a student or any other black person wanted to get a book from the library, you just call the downtown library and they will send it out to your branch at AU or wherever the branch was.
You were working on it through the Council on Human Relations.
Yes.
And then within the black community, there was an organization called the Friends of the Library, and a woman named Annie McFeeters, who was the branch librarian down at the Auburn branch. They were working on it from a different angle. Were you aware
No.
of the multiple sides of this?
I didn't know that.
So your work was only through the council?
My work was only through the council. And
What transpired between Saturday and Wednesday?
you'd have to ask George Goodwin, but I rather imagine that
I think
George...
one of the things that he has told me is something about this Uncle Remus branch being declared off limits for a while because it was too hot. The downtown could be desegregated more easily.
I only knew that he called me back later and said it's going to happen, we will desegregate. And he didn't mention any specific branch.
How would you have gotten to know George?
See, I don't know. Atlanta seems so small that everybody knew everybody else. Had known George and Skippy. Maybe we had children in school together, but I had known him. And of course I had, when we had met with the board, I got to know him because we'd had quite a few meetings prior to that, but I knew everybody on the board.
The reason, I guess the broader question I'm asking is sort of, what was the relationship between people who were fairly liberal on the issue of race and who in fact were integrationists at a time when that was a distinct minority position, with those who had greater access to power, with those who were in power in Atlanta? So how did that work, that
Well,
relationship in that process?
The best way I know to explain this is an anecdote I heard once about James McBride Dabbs, who was asked by, he lived on his family plantation in South Carolina, and he was asked how they felt about his having black people, this 1919 or something. And his response was, well, I know what they say. They say that James McBride Dabbs, he's a damn fool, but let's have him to dump. So it was part of being part of the same group. I think it was terribly important that I had grown up here. My parents had grown up here. So that looking back on it, I guess I hadn't been quite so outspoken at the time that every year I would go and call on the power structure to get money for the league. But there was never a hint that there was any rancor or any resentment. I imagine looking back that I was welcomed in the door because I was Robert's daughter and they'd known Robert, and they had probably asked for money for something for their pet chore, and Southern Cross had given them that. Pardon me, he can tell time, it's his dinner time.
Of children, I came across this piece that was in the Atlanta Journal magazine
Yes.
in 1946.
Yeah.
Babies are, young mother of three says babies are fun. And this piece, which appeared in 1948,
Boy,
Dad
you've really
About
been
Mother
around.
brings better world to children. And I was wondering if you recall anything about either of them. One was written by yourself. And
Yeah, I wrote that one because I was feeling poor and they paid me $25. There's a rather interesting little sequel to that. Right after that appeared, a woman called me and said that she had just moved to Atlanta from Savannah and she had 3 children just the same ages, and she liked to write too and felt we would have so much in common, and she would like me to bring the children and come to tea. Well, I brought those children, and as you can see, Nankin was 10 months old. And they grew up, and our daughter Nankin married her son Gene. And he now says to everybody, I knew the minute I saw her she was something. I tried to pull her diapers off.
That's really funny. So how did either of those things come about? The article that you wrote or the one about you?
I'm not sure. Well, I just wrote the article and sent it in to them, and they liked it, so they sent somebody out to take the picture. But the others...
The other one's written by Margaret Turner.
Yeah, Nigel, now settle down. There were an awful lot of articles about any number of things. I don't know why they did that.
Okay.
But there were.
Then
I was usually quotable because I never had enough sense to keep my mouth shut. But what was odd looking back on it is that I have always felt that I operated on a double track. If there was this sociable lady who ran around talking about wildflowers to garden clubs and had children who went to the right schools and that sort of stuff, and then there was this fierce radical in the background trying to tear up the pea patch. And I never denied that either one of them were there, but people evidently saw what they wanted to see.
describe that more, the double track.
Well, I don't know how to describe it other than
You felt that it was a double track, or
I never thought about it one way or the other, but if you look through our scrapbooks, which are most of them are out in Emory, there's this weird juxtaposition of that I was the cause celebre at the Republican convention, because after I abandoned the Republicans because I wouldn't vote for Goldwater, then somebody wanted me to run later on, and some other people didn't want to let me back in because I had not supported Goldwater. And then maybe 2 days later in the paper would be something about Nankin's debut party, and it was. I'm sure there are other people who do the same thing. It just.
but to you, there wasn't any dichotomy between these things.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that probably they were contradictory, but well, I don't know.
Well, they're not
I hope
necessarily
everybody
contradictory.
else is as inconsistent as I occasionally am.
Have you thought? I mean, you're saying though that you did not ever really think of it as being inconsistent.
No, I think I did,
You
if
did.
I thought about it at all. But on the one hand, I was doing what I'd done all my life. And on the other hand, I was doing what my heart and my brain told me I had to do. And there was nothing immoral about the social occasions. It was just silly. I just don't know. I've written for the paper off and on, for not in a long time. But I did what I used to call pre-Bombeck stuff. I would write about the children until they all threatened to kill me. And then I gave that up.
I also saw that you wrote a letter. I haven't tracked down the actual letter to the Ladies' Home Journal in the late 40s.
Yes.
Maybe you could tell me about the circumstances of that.
I can't remember what impelled me to write it, but there must have been an article in the Ladies' Home Journal which was talking about the South and the general mindset of Southerners and that they were racist. And so I simply wrote and said that my husband and I were both Georgia born and bred, and that we were bringing up our children to believe that the only difference between them and the Negro was a matter of pigmentation. And that was, I think, all. I think it was a quite short letter. And I had a couple of people just say, I saw your letter in the Ladies' Home Journal, period. The Ladies' Home Journal at the time was doing a series called How America Lives or something. And they wanted to do a story about the family, but I thought we better not do that. But it had piqued some curiosity up in Philadelphia.
Okay.
I know Helen Mencken was subject to many of the same things that you're talking about. She was interested in talking about the issues and her political career, but she was constantly being written about as, you know, mother and wife and that sort of thing, even though that wasn't what she thought was important. And I think in your own experience, Hope was often described in the press as a group of concerned housewives and mothers.
Yeah.
Is that how you all saw yourselves?
That really is, I'm afraid, how we saw ourselves, that this was,
Well, you were
but
concerned.
it was all part of the same thing. My poor mother never could quite decide what to do because she really violently disagreed with most of the things I was saying and doing. And yet she was very proud of the fact that she had a prominent daughter. She never could quite figure out how to deal with that. And the older she got, and the foggier she got, and the less she understood what I was doing, the more she approved of it. I can remember once there was a group called Active Voters for a while. And they decided they wanted to raise some money, and so they were going to invite some women of a certain amount of wealth and invite them all to please come and join Active Voters and give them each $100. One of them was a Mrs. Fairley, and anyway, I agreed to help usher at this occasion. Mother came in, and I seated her well toward the back, and Mrs. Fairley beckoned to me, and she said, Nan, I don't want to tell you your business, but that's Helen Kaiser Schwab, and she's quite hard of hearing. I said, I know who she is, and I know she is hard of hearing, and I am seating her back there because if she hears anything you say, you won't get a nickel. But as it is, she'll be glad to see all her friends. And so it worked out that way. Mama gave him the $100, and she never knew what it was all about. But Mrs. Fairley had not realized that that was my mother. She hadn't put the connection together.
That's funny.
I just have one more question on this aspect of the media and the press coverage. Then, for example, with Hope, but as well as something like Active Voters or the League of Women Voters, do you think that the activities and the motivations were accurately reported on?
I think probably so. I'm trying to remember. It was my first real glimpse into the power of the press because Ralph McGill had evidently been looking for some citizens group, any citizens group, to say something. So when Hope was formed, he immediately grabbed it. I can't remember whether there were editorials or simply articles, but it took off immediately. It sounded much larger than it was.
Although, isn't it true that, I think I've seen you quoted somewhere as saying that he didn't willingly go and join things like Fill the Tower with Hope when he filled the Tower Theater with Hope?
Now, he did it, but
did.
it took a bit of persuading. He was uneasy. After all, he had to, well, you know the way he wrote. He'd write something meaningful, and then he'd write 3 or 4 good old bird dog columns and soothe everybody down. So I guess I couldn't blame him for being somewhat more cautious than we were, but cautious he was. And it was therefore a little annoying sometimes to have it look as if he had dragged us into it instead of the other way around. But it didn't really matter that much. But he, I think maybe just 2 or 3 weeks after the formation of Hope, there was a mention in Time magazine about it. And Britt looked at it and called me and said, "Come here and look at this thing." And then he said, "Up until this minute, I thought Hope was you and Muriel Loki talking on the telephone." So that night at the tower was, I guess, as physically frightening as anything that's ever happened to me, which shows what a sheltered life I have lived compared to, say, Francis Pauling.
Let's describe the night at the tower.
Well, we didn't know what to expect. This was the first time we had had a public meeting of these integrationists. We knew, I've forgotten how we knew, that George Bright, who had bombed the temple, was going to be there.
And how did he know he had bombed the temple?
That's just what I'm wondering. What happened after he bombed it? Why did everybody know he had bombed it, and therefore why was he free to go to the Tower Theater? I don't know, but I know he was. And that he did come.
And who was George Bright?
All I know is the name. He must have been a racist. Have you ever talked to Rabbi Sugarman? I'm sure he could.
No, I'm going to be starting a series of interviews with somebody else on the temple bombing shortly, but
Because I'm trying to think, Rabbi Sugarman, he would have been maybe in his early teens, but he was born and bred here in Atlanta. He would certainly know.
But anyway, you all knew that George Bright was going
Yeah.
to be at the Tower Theater.
Yes, and I don't know how we knew that either. And they had promised us that he was going to be carefully watched.
They?
The police, I guess.
Okay.
Muriel Loki might remember more about
So
this than
anyway, let's talk about that evening.
I was ushering people to their seats, and I was nervous. I knew that George Bright was in the balcony, and I kept turning my back on that balcony and walking down that aisle over and over again. And I was scared, and I don't think I've ever been physically scared before or since.
What happened?
Nothing. There was a very good occasion. There was nobody who asked any antagonistic questions, and Ralph handled it very well.
Sylvan Meyer was there.
I guess he was. I hadn't thought of Sylvan in a long time.
Speakers are Harry Fifield. Do you know him?
Yeah, I remember he was the minister of the
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian Church.
And there's a woman from Little Rock.
Well, I know that my inspiration was this old lady from Little Rock named Adolphine Terry, because she had been a member of Vassar class of '02. And Vassar had written about her, and so I thought she was a wonderful lady.
So she was an inspiration, a conscious inspiration
Yeah.
to you in all this.
Mhm.
Let's
No.
change tapes.